Firewatch is one of those breakout indie games that continues to be enjoyed by new players and spark conversations within the gaming community even 9 years after its release. And it's one that instantly resonated with me. Unlike many of the games I played in my childhood with a protagonist that was some sort of hero with these extraordinary physical powers, or was some sort of puzzle-solving mastermind, Henry was just a regular guy around my age that had adult problems that he wasn't quite sure how to navigate. And there was something really comforting in that. The plot of Firewatch is one that many players connect with because of the combination of the real and the surreal that gives players so many different things to latch onto. Were all of the mysterious happenings the cause of some big government conspiracy or supernatural force? Or was it all just the paranoia of a man who'd spent a bit too much time alone in the woods? Firewatch essentially weaves together two narratives that we don't actually see. The story of our protagonist Henry struggling to cope with his wife's diagnosis of dementia, and the story of our antagonist Ned Goodwin, desperately doing whatever it takes to keep the world from discovering his dark secret. Julia's story, or rather the idea of Julia's story, has always stuck with me. Perhaps it's because I first played Firewatch during my time working with dementia patients, and the idea of who we are being slowly erased by Alzheimer's unsettled me on an existential level. The opening of Firewatch highlights Julia and Henry's struggles with her dementia, but really just glosses over that part of their life, and with that part of their life being told entirely in text, it can create a disconnect as to why Henry ultimately made the decision to go off into the wilderness in the first place. And this conversation around the hardship of watching a loved one slowly deteriorate from dementia is something I don't see brought up very often in discussions about Firewatch, except for comment threads here and there, and even then the perspectives are pretty mixed. So today I want to explore my thoughts on the story of Henry and Julia that lies hidden underneath the main story of Firewatch.
Good night. Welcome to the job.
Firewatch opens with text on screen, giving us an overview of the relationship between Henry and Julia, starting from the moment they meet in Boulder, Colorado, back in 1975. The first line of the game is, "You see Julia," written to both you, and Henry, you. And while you don't know who Julia is yet, this clearly establishes her as a driving force for Henry. The game then cuts back to the present, and there is a noticeable absence as you, as Henry, prepares to go out into the world without her. The past is juxtaposed against the present as Henry makes the 2-day trek to his assigned lookout tower, where he'll spend the summer. The hike feels peaceful, with Henry surrounded by the serenity of nature and the beauty of the natural world. There is a liminal quality to Henry's hike through the brush, a journey of transition as Henry leaves the life he knows and enters into this new and unfamiliar world. The past limits your ability to choose. Sometimes it tells you exactly what you're doing, while other times it seemingly gives you two choices. However, they are not always the decisions that you would make if you were you, but you're not you, you're Henry. And these are the decisions that are consistent with who Henry is. I find it interesting that this introduction isn't actually really about Henry, at least not directly. It's centered almost entirely around Julia. We learn that she's a professor of evolutionary biology at CU Boulder, that she likes to draw, and that she likes to journal. Julia is the one who brings up wanting a dog, wanting to have children, and wanting to move to Connecticut. We don't really find out much about who Henry is, or what he does, or what he wants, except in a reaction to Julia and how things unfold in her life. Fast forward to 1985, when she has her first episode of confusion, lashing out at a colleague and crying in the stairwell. The doctors suspect that she has early onset dementia at just 41 years old, and this diagnosis derails their shared hopes and dreams. Julia was moving up in her career. They had plans of starting a family, and now they have to give up the future they envisioned as Julia's cognitive deterioration starts to chip away at who she is, piece by piece.
What does she have?
She's got Alzheimer's, like, dementia.
Whoa. How old was she?
Is she? She's alive. She's with her family in Melbourne, Australia. She's 43.
Fuck.
Alzheimer's that early in life is quite uncommon. so it's not something that most people would even consider having to face in their 40s. Although admittedly, I do sometimes get that little what if thought in the back of my mind whenever I walk into a room and immediately forget why I walked into that room. So to allow Julia to continue with her life with as much normalcy as possible for as long as possible, they didn't tell anyone. And it makes sense that they wouldn't want to tell anyone. She still had her career to be concerned for, and she wanted to go as far with that as she could. Sadly, it only took 2 years for her cognitive state to decline to the point where she could no longer hide her symptoms. And Henry had no choice but to make the tough decision to open up to loved ones about this devastating news.
What was it like when you guys found out?
Devastating, especially for her. You can understand.
And for you?
Anyway, everything she worked for was taken away, and that was it. Yeah.
But there is a bright side. Now there are others who can provide some support and be there for her. However, Julia's family lives in Australia, so they can't be there all the time. And as for friends, well, friends mean well, but also have their own lives to focus on. Later on in the game, Henry starts to reflect on how he hasn't reached out to her family as much as he should.
Are you gonna go be with her? Just go back to Boulder? You should go be with her.
Maybe I'll go visit. I don't know.
Well, why not?
She's with her family in Melbourne. They're not big fans of mine.
Oh.
Her sister, Susan, is great, but her parents, I think they always thought she could do better, and that I could have done a better job looking after her.
Fuck that. I have no doubt you did your best.
I don't know.
If you want to go visit her, you should go. Don't let a couple of assholes keep you away from someone you love.
I'll think about it.
So he ends up caring for her full time for at least a solid year before it's suggested that she be placed in a nursing home. And whether he does or whether he doesn't, the following year comes with its own unique set of challenges and regrets. Firewatch is typically described as escapism in the sense that Henry is running away from his problems and avoiding his responsibilities by abandoning his wife to go out and have a grand adventure. But I think this is a bit of an oversimplification of his motivation and perhaps a bit dismissive of his internal conflict. I actually think that the biggest problem is that Henry took on too much responsibility for too long without enough of the help that he needed, and this wore him down considerably to the point where he felt burnt out and that he was failing in his role as a husband and caretaker. So for him, once Julia was safely in the care of her family, it became easier to just not willingly continue to take on that stress. Because let's be honest, taking care of someone with dementia full-time without proper support is really hard.
I worry about it all day when I'm at work, and it's draining. It's emotionally stressful.
I've worked with dementia patients for many years, and I've seen many family members that have had to adapt to the changes in their loved ones as their loved ones' cognitive functioning started to decline. And not every caregiver has the same capacity to properly adjust to their loved ones' changing needs, and it can overwhelm them pretty quickly.
The stress is taking a toll. Caregiving has left Robin living paycheck to paycheck. She's lost 50 pounds and can't remember the last time she went to the doctor.
So you can understand how caregivers sometimes get sicker than the people they're caring for.
Yep, definitely.
It's not just about forgetting things or getting things all mixed up, but people with dementia can have huge personality changes. They can become hostile, at times even violent. They lose control over their emotions. They forget how to work their own bodily functions, including where they're supposed to go to the toilet.
Her agitation really continued. Her refusing to dress, take meds, sometimes eat. She became combative. She started hitting me.
They may experience hallucinations and delusions. They wander into unsafe places, or their ability to walk becomes so compromised that they're prone to tripping and falling, sometimes incurring significant injuries. And for so many, they forget that they forget. So they resist all of these new restrictions placed on their freedom by those around them who are simply just trying to keep them safe.
Balancing both their needs and trying to do the best for them both all the time, you end up forgetting about yourself. I go to bed most nights absolutely exhausted. It's a really unpleasant and nasty disease, and it's just devastating. It's taken so many things away from us and our family and from Mark.
Henry would become angry with Julia for trying to do things for herself, like cooking, because it was pretty dangerous. And at times he resorted to following her around the house to watch over her, while other times he'd put her to bed and then he'd stay out all night to completely avoid her. And sure, we don't really know what Julia was like, but we do have some clues. The biggest of which comes later in the game when Henry says,
Maybe you're not real. Maybe I'm losing my mind.
What?
Julia, maybe it's happening to me, and I'm imagining that I have a boss out here and that we're being spied on.
Henry.
Maybe there was something in the water, or our condo was underneath some power lines, and you, Delilah, you're not real.
Through this, we can deduce that Julia very likely developed paranoid hallucinations and delusions to such intensity that there was likely no reasoning with her at those times. Having seen this so frequently, Henry is now worried that his mind is also being consumed by a false sense of reality. And let's not forget about her outburst towards her colleague, or how she freaks out during intimate moments with Henry. There are likely many moments of these intense emotional displays, and Henry may not have really known how to handle that. For him, Julia's decline reflects a loss of identity, not just for her, but for himself as well. He loses the Julia he knew, but he also loses himself in the process.
Mark? He's like a different person. It's like having a stranger. His personality is so incredibly different. Unfortunately, frontotemporal dementia takes that away.
Caregivers of those with dementia are subject to feelings of caregiver fatigue due to the physical, emotional, and financial toll caregiving can have. This plays a big role in how paranoid Henry became to all of the events happening around him. Psychologically, he was already in a more susceptible space and likely wasn't reasoning through situations as rationally as maybe he would have had this not been the case. Caregivers may also experience a kind of grief. Caregiver grief is a type of prolonged grief caused by the anticipation of death. Depending on their loved one's prognosis, a caregiver may spend weeks, months, or even years watching the health of their loved one decline further and further, knowing that with each passing day, they're moving closer and closer to the end. Alzheimer's disease is not directly fatal, but a person's life is shortened due to other physical and neurological complications that come about as a result of the dementia. It's heartbreaking watching as your loved one marches towards death. Your grieving begins before their life even ends. Editor Journey here. I just want to clarify that when I say it's not directly fatal, what I mean is the deaths are due to the other medical complications that are caused by the brain matter deterioration of dementia, especially damage in the brainstem, which is responsible for many of our important functions, such as our heart rate, balance, our sleep-wake cycle, physical sensations, breathing, swallowing. Lots of people will develop what's called aspiration pneumonia, which basically means inhaling food into their lungs. They will forget to eat, or they'll forget how to eat, so they become malnourished and dehydrated. Their immune systems become compromised, so they become sick easier and they get sick for longer. Their bodies are physically weaker, so if they fall, they don't always recover well. And if they're bedridden, they can get infections from bed sores. Just things like that are what actually takes their life, but those complications would not have happened were it not for the Alzheimer's. So, just wanted to be clear. The average life expectancy for someone after diagnosis of early onset Alzheimer's is only about 8 to 12 years after symptoms emerge. And this is by today's standards. Back in 1989, there weren't even medications approved to treat symptoms of Alzheimer's or slow the progression. The first ones weren't approved by the Food and Drug Administration until the 1990s, several years after Julia's diagnosis. And we see the toll this takes on Henry. If you choose the option where he decides to keep her at home, this is the timeline where he copes with stress by drinking way too much. His drinking becomes so problematic that he ends up with a DUI. This is also the timeline where the home is in total shambles because he's not able to take care of her and himself and the house, so everything just falls apart. Then there's option 2, the alternative timeline where he realizes that he's in over his head and places her in a nursing facility. However, in this timeline, there's a profound sense of guilt and shame that others had to step in to take over his responsibility. This is his wife. He signed up for in sickness and in health. He's supposed to take care of her, not put her in some nursing home. It's the timeline that he feels immense judgment from his friends' wives, and he becomes this cautionary tale to their husbands. Do not do to me what Henry did to Julia. It gets to the point where Henry withdraws further into himself, no longer finding comfort in spending time with his friends. It's a real damned if you do, damned if you don't type of situation because no matter which option he chooses, it never truly feels like he's making the right one. And when you're a caregiver, you have to do all of this on top of having to make money and pay bills and do chores and keep up with the hospital visits and try to keep your sanity. And without even consciously realizing it, that love that you have can start to feel like a burden. But you can't say that out loud. You can't say to people that it feels like you can't do this anymore because you're supposed to love this person enough to do all that you can for them, no matter what. No matter how hard it gets. Even as you silently wonder to yourself, I'm not sure how much longer I can keep going like this. And as a result, Henry's mental health suffered. And this is during a time in the US when there was still a really big stigma surrounding mental health and seeking treatment. People didn't want to be perceived as crazy or have others believe that they couldn't handle life on their own, so they just coped in whatever ways they could. In Henry's case, he leaned on alcohol, and then when that didn't work, he took a job in the forest for 4 months. Now, this isn't to say that leaving was the right thing for Henry to do, but I'm sure on some level he felt relieved. Her family had taken over and he knew she was in good hands, so he could take a step back. Now, this is a decision that many players strongly disagreed with and found it really hard to empathize with because he wasn't honoring his marriage vows. The ideal thing for a spouse to do is to be with their loved one every day until the end, no matter how hard things get. But humans don't always do the ideal thing. We're incredibly complicated creatures. And while I don't believe that I'd make the same decision that Henry did, at least I hope I wouldn't, I personally don't judge him for it. And to me, he actually seems pretty conflicted. While he stepped back from his role as her caretaker, he continues to grapple with the guilt of leaving her, but also his fear for what life will be like once he returns. Even though the bulk of Firewatch is centered around the relationship between Henry and Delilah and the mystery, Julia remains an undercurrent during Henry's time in the Shoshone. The memories of her are always there, and she isn't completely forgotten by Henry even as he gets wrapped up in everything else. He even brings along Julia's journal, taking a quiet moment on his trek out there to flip through it, although he finds it much too painful for him. Henry's placement in Two Forks Tower is actually quite fitting. The saying, coming to a fork in the road, is a well-known saying when we have to make a choice between two different decisions without knowing what the outcome of those decisions will be or if we're making the right choice. And with Henry taking this time to clear his head and think, a fire lookout's job is the perfect place for this. It's not the most exciting, it's spent mostly in solitude, but it's what he needs to make that decision at this fork in the road.
The reason why the game is not a simulation of being a fire lookout is because what everyone talks about is that the number one challenge with the job is that it is incredibly, impossibly boring.
Because you can't, like, read a book. You can't, like, be doing other things, right? Like,
not really.
Yeah.
At the end of day 3, where Delilah mentions, it's like, Henry's like, well, what do I do for the rest of summer? She's like, you sit in that chair and you look out the window. That is actually what fire lookouts really do.
He also brings along the old typewriter given to him by her sister Susan so that he may use it as a form of therapy since he didn't want to talk to a professional about his feelings. And I don't know if you've ever carried an old school typewriter. Many of you have probably never even seen a typewriter in person, but those things are pretty dang heavy. So to carry something so cumbersome on a 2-day hike to spend 4 months grappling with your thoughts, well, that says to me that he at least intended to take things seriously. Now, if you're like me, you either didn't initially read what Henry was typing because you were so caught up in the game itself, or you didn't think to trek back on days that didn't require you to be in the tower. Or also, like I experienced sometimes, you had that game glitch where the first page that Henry pulled out of the typewriter just didn't load properly, so you just kind of forgot to check after that. But there's a good bit of information that we can find out about Henry if we read through these writings. These journal entries are the closest that we ever get to understanding the real Henry and how he really feels about the situation. Because Henry in the introduction is just reacting to what happens to Julia. And throughout the game, we have the option to have Henry avoid talking about his wife at all. But in these quiet moments where he's all alone, he's not avoiding. He's writing his thoughts down before he even starts his day. So I want to go through the journal entries, in particular the references to Julia that Henry managed to get down on paper in between all of the chaos. Henry writes that Julia's sister Susan suggested that he use the typewriter to write and stay connected to the real Jules. But when she says the real Jules, what she actually means is the old Jules, the Jules that's gone and is never coming back. I actually made a good fire last night and I flipped through Julia's journal. I still feel weird about having it, but Susan thinks it's a good way to, what's the word she used? Stay connected to the real Jules. But as I was sitting there looking at it, I don't know if it's a good idea for me to keep doing that. It didn't feel good, and yeah, like I said, I didn't sleep great after that, but it was probably the bear. Oh yeah, he also wrote that there was probably a bear in the woods near his campsite. It's day 2, and after having his tower ransacked, window broken, and freezing all night, his dreams go to his wife. These are dreams that he has clearly had many times before, dreams that he hoped to get some relief from while sleeping in a new environment. I was 100% sure I wouldn't have any Jules dreams out here since I was sleeping in a new place and everything, but sure enough, during the 30 minutes I fell asleep around 5 a.m., there we were, back on the beach in Melbourne. That's that moment where I know it's coming, where I know the water is going to come up and up and up, and I think I'm going to spew or my heart is going to stop or something, but this time I woke up before anything happened. Maybe that's progress. It's the 3rd day, and while Delilah is trying to get the communication wires fixed, Julia is still at the forefront of Henry's mind. Her family is as well. He's realizing that he's avoided reaching out to Julia's family due to being a bit intimidated by Julia's mother. And he knows now that he had a bigger support system than he realized, and he's welcome in their life. He's been taking on this burden all alone for so long, and he really didn't even have to. A few days before I left, I got a call from Jules' dad. Realized I hadn't really talked to him over the past few years as much as I thought. I think I was so worried about getting Madeline on the phone whenever I would call that I just stopped calling altogether. I guess that's the sort of thing writing all the stuff down is supposed to make me realize. It's now day 33, and while nothing major has happened within the Shoshone for quite some time, Henry hasn't written about Julia for a month and hasn't even thought about her much for a week, and this frightens him. There's an increasing feeling of guilt as he worries that she was thinking of him while he wasn't thinking of her. Her not remembering him is beyond her control, while him not thinking about her is more a matter of choice, choosing to become so engrossed in his day-to-day life that she's become less and less of a priority. The problem is I realized that I hadn't thought about Jules much this week. I went back and looked through my pages and she's not in there, just the job and talking to Delilah. No thinking about what I'm going to do this fall. But he kind of has been thinking of her more than he realized. 2 weeks prior, he called Delilah sleep-talking, believing he was talking to Julia. And he's had opportunities to talk with Delilah about Julia, which he can choose to engage with.
Anyway, Julia, girlfriend? Ex? Sorry, I don't mean to pry.
That would be my wife, Julia.
Oh, like your wife? Or like she's taken half my stuff wife?
My wife.
But you're here.
She's sick, and I shouldn't be here, but I am.
I'm sorry, Henry. What is it?
We'll get into it.
Opening up an avenue for Henry to get out of his own head and trust another person enough to help him work through this. I got a little upset thinking about maybe there was a moment she was thinking about me while I wasn't thinking about her. And then I started thinking about why the hell am I out here and why am I not just with her, taking care of her, seeing how she's doing? What if she's doing better and I don't even know? I don't think Mick and Madeline would even know how to get a hold of me. If they did, I don't even know if they would. If they did, what would I do? I have a couple of good weeks and then all of a sudden I can't stop thinking, why the fuck am I out here? Then we get all the way to day 78, a month and a half before he makes another mention of Julia. 2 days prior, the journal entry on July 15th was about his appreciation for his time in the forest and for having Delilah as a supervisor, and feeling conflicted about returning home. I've been thinking a lot about life after working out here. One thing is for sure, I want to come back next year. Would be great if Dee was back in Thoroughfare and I got to do Two Forks again. After this season, I was thinking if I would see if there was more NFS work out there, or call up Dixon at Cotton Mountain and see about working at the slopes. Would be nice to get back into skiing, and honestly, after a couple of months of being outside, I'm not sure I'm ready to be stuck indoors. The entry on July 16th referenced him finding the clipboard, being knocked out, and their increased paranoia about being part of a secret behavioral study. I know that sounds crazy, but someone is out there listening to us and attacked me. They're taking notes about our conversations. We think there might be some sort of study going on, like maybe we were given these jobs not just to look for fires, but to be a part of a behavioral study or something. Fuck, I know this all sounds insane. It is insane. I don't know how to explain any of it. But on the 17th, just before he goes down into the cave to hopefully find out some answers, he realizes that he may not make it out, and he starts to realize that he hasn't been in contact with his own family much either. I wonder what will happen if I don't make it back. It's hard to imagine at this stage anybody would notice. Susan, my sister out in Maryland, would eventually get a call, and I'd feel bad for not seeing her and the kids for so long. Also, they both have sisters named Susan. The fact is completely irrelevant to this video, but I thought it was pretty cool. So Julia is back on his mind again, and there's a mix of fears. Fears that no one would notice if he disappeared, fears that he will never be seen again, fears that Julia won't even remember him, and even worse, fears that Julia will remember him and know that he abandoned her forever. But Julia, it's been 6 months now, and maybe I wouldn't even register. Maybe I don't even register. Oh, I just felt a little panic there. What if I do register and I just left her alone? Yet he goes anyway. At this point, the desire to unravel the mystery, to figure out what was going on, is so strong that even if it means that he'll never see his wife again, he's willing to take that chance. And I don't think he wanted to die, but the possibility of dying wasn't enough to keep him out of the cave. When he expressed fear that he was becoming like Julia, experiencing paranoia from her own mind, that was a genuine fear. And I think the possibility that he was unraveling in the same way was really starting to scare him, and he just needed to know what was real. At daylight, I'm going to head into the cave in the canyon and see what I can find. I don't know what else to say, really. I know I should probably take extensive notes. Yesterday, I had the thought that maybe I'm not quite right in the head. It just came across me for a moment, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't think it for a second. I'm going down into the cave and I just hope I find something. I don't care what happens as long as I find something. I wonder if on some level, if he didn't return, then perhaps he felt that was for the best. I wonder if he felt that it would make things easier, for him anyway, that it would absolve him of having to make the decision of whether or not to return to a life that he still wasn't really ready to be a part of again. Now I'm sure at least some of you might wonder, well, if Henry went out to clear his head and heal emotionally, then why would he take his wedding ring off? And why is there an option to lean into a relationship with Delilah?
I wish I was over there.
I wish you were too.
Well, who hasn't at least heard of someone who, instead of working through their problems in their relationship, decided that it would be easier to just leave the relationship altogether? Or even just start over with someone else? A new life without all the complications of their old life. Remember, this is the same guy who decided to leave his sick wife all alone while he spent the night at the bar drinking, and who didn't tell her family how bad things had gotten until after he spent a night in jail for a DUI. So Henry doesn't always make the best decisions. Who Henry will be when he returns, or at least what we hope for him, is that he's learned from this experience, because we don't actually get to see the end of his story. Is he ready to fully recommit himself to his wife? Or has he decided that his freedom is more appealing? He could be like Ned and disappear into the wild and avoid accountability. He has the option to just not get on the helicopter, let it fly away and leave his old life behind. But I like to believe that Henry went home, took care of his wife, and was by her side until the very end.
When you put them away, for want of a better word, it was the hardest thing that you can never forgive yourself for. Because what if you misjudged it? What if they could have been home for another week?
It was like abandoning someone in trouble. It was like pushing something aside that you couldn't handle. Like, it's important for us to carry on doing what we're doing, and that's basically carrying our guilt.
I'm going to leave a link in the description for the Reddit post that I used that had already transcribed all of Henry's journal entries. It saved me a ton of time not having to write all of that out by hand. And there's even more information in those writings than I shared in this video, so it's worth a read. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please like, share, subscribe, all of that good stuff. And if you're a fan of Firewatch, I really recommend the game Still Wakes the Deep. It's sort of a cosmic horror version of Firewatch on an oil rig. I never really thought about it that way, but it actually kind of is. Well, that's all, folks. I'm Journey, and I'll see you in the next one.